The Pont-Saint-Esprit poisoning. Imagine one day you grab one of the everyday breads you eat every day, and you notice it looks a little gray and strange. But you don't care, and you eat it anyway. A few hours later, you start hallucinating that you're an airplane, you jump out of a window, and you die. This is the story of France's poisoned bread. In 1951, the bakers of Pont-Saint-Esprit, France, received their flour through a government distribution network. The flour came from several specific mills that supplied the region, and the bakers had almost no control over its quality. Several weeks before the crisis began, reports of poisoning after eating bread started coming from villages around the town. In the village of Isirak, at least 20 people developed symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, headaches, and skin lesions. Shortly afterward, in the town of Kono, one baker reported that his customers believed his bread was the cause of severe diarrhea, while he and his family were experiencing the same symptoms themselves. He suspected the flour and said its quality was unusually poor. The flour produced a sticky dough, did not ferment properly, and eventually resulted in a gray and unusual-looking loaf of bread. In Saint-Geniez-de-Comolas, another baker informed the mayor that the flour he had received was gray, and even contaminated with insects. The mayor immediately banned its use. On August 16, 1951, local doctors were faced with a wave of patients who all showed similar symptoms: nausea, vomiting, chills, and an intense feeling of heat. In the following days, the situation became worse, and some patients began suffering from hallucinations and seizures. On the night of August 24th, a man who believed he was an airplane threw himself out of a window and died. That same night, an 11-year-old boy, during a psychotic episode, attempted to harm his mother. As doctors began investigating, they noticed a common pattern. Almost all of the patients had bought bread from Briand's bakery in Pont-Saint-Esprit. In one nearby village, it was also discovered that all members of a family who had eaten bread from this bakery became ill, while those who had bought bread from another bakery remained healthy. On the morning of August 20th, Roche Briand, the owner of the bakery from which most of the affected people had bought their bread, was questioned by police for further investigation. The investigation focused on the bread that had been baked on August 16th. It quickly became clear that the flour used in the bread had not all come from the same source. During the process, the bakery ran out of flour, forcing him to borrow flour from two other bakeries. According to his assistant, when one of these batches of flour was collected, the baker himself was already ill, so the flour was delivered through his assistant instead. Witness accounts were not the same. Some people described the bread as normal and ordinary, while others reported a strange smell and a gray color. The bread that caused this incident contained only 4 ingredients: flour, water, yeast, and salt. Investigations showed that the water, yeast, and salt had no role in the poisoning. Attention therefore returned to the flour. Tracing the path of the flour led investigators to the region's distribution network. There, they discovered that part of the region's flour supply came from 2 mills, one of which, the Maurice Mallet mill, had already been criticized for the poor quality of its products. During the investigation, it was revealed that some of the grain delivered to this mill was of poor quality. Despite being contaminated with insects and dust, it had been mixed with other grain and processed into flour. Eventually, the mill owner and one of the grain suppliers were arrested for negligence in distributing contaminated materials. Overall, the incident affected more than 250 people. Around 50 people were sent to psychiatric institutions, and approximately 7 people lost their lives. Several weeks later, doctors concluded that the most likely cause of the disaster was contamination of the flour by ergot, a fungus that grows on grains, and whose toxins can cause hallucinations, seizures, and severe neurological disorders. The Spanish toxic oil syndrome. In 1981, Spain was still going through the transition away from Franco's dictatorship, a period when many people were facing economic difficulties and had low incomes. During that period, several Spanish companies were importing rapeseed oil from France. The oil was originally imported for industrial use and was not approved for human consumption. To prevent it from being sold as an edible product, regulations required around 2% aniline to be added to it. Aniline created an unpleasant smell and taste, making the oil legally unsuitable for consumption. The low price of this oil attracted the attention of some traders. They bought the oil, refined it, changed its color and smell, and then sold it in local markets as cooking oil, a process that brought them significant profits. The adulterated oil was mainly distributed in the outskirts of Madrid and in some central regions of Spain, often in unlabeled bottles or containers with invalid labels. Many of the buyers were low-income families who were looking for a cheaper type of oil. In early May 1981, doctors in several hospitals in Madrid began encountering patients with unusual symptoms. The patients were suffering from fever, shortness of breath, coughing, severe muscle pain, and respiratory problems. The severity of the respiratory symptoms, along with unusual chest X-ray results, led doctors to initially believe they were dealing with an unknown form of pneumonia. Because of this, the illness was temporarily named atypical pneumonia. In many cases, several members of the same family became ill at the same time. This, along with the rapid increase in the number of cases, led doctors to initially suspect an infectious disease. However, investigations failed to identify any specific microbial cause, and epidemiological studies were started. To find the source of the illness, research teams visited affected families and asked about the foods they had consumed and their recent purchases. Eventually, researchers discovered that many of the affected people had bought oil from specific sellers. Further investigations showed that almost all of the affected families had been using a cheap, unbranded type of oil. After the adulterated oil was identified as the source of the illness, the Spanish government issued a public warning in June 1981 and ordered the immediate removal of the contaminated oil from the market. In the end, more than 20,000 people became ill, and around 300 to 400 people lost their lives. Many survivors continued to struggle with neurological damage and mobility problems for years afterward. A large criminal investigation was launched, and police traced the oil supply chain. It was eventually discovered that several companies had been involved in importing and distributing the oil. During the legal proceedings, 38 people connected to the oil industry were prosecuted, and several of the main figures involved were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The Manchester beer poisoning. In 1900, doctors in Manchester, England, began encountering patients who were mostly heavy alcohol users and were seeking medical help with symptoms such as numbness in their hands and feet, muscle weakness, and nerve problems. At first, doctors believed these issues were the result of excessive alcohol consumption. However, as the number of cases increased, it took around 4 months for the true cause of the illness to be identified. In the end, more than 6,000 people in England were poisoned. More than 70 people lost their lives, and many others were left with muscle weakness and difficulty walking. Eventually, doctors discovered that the nerve damage and changes in skin color were all connected to a common cause: arsenic. It was also found that people who mainly consumed distilled drinks, such as whiskey and gin, were less affected compared to those who mostly drank beer. This led attention toward beer. Samples of beer were collected from the pubs that the patients used to visit, and tests confirmed the presence of arsenic in them. After beer was identified as the cause of the illness, investigations began to find the source of the contamination. At that time, some breweries were replacing part of the barley malt with a processed sugar called invert sugar in order to reduce costs. This sugar was produced by breaking down starch with sulfuric acid, and Bostock and Company supplied it to breweries. The company obtained the sulfuric acid it needed from John Nicholson and Sons. Further investigations showed that the arsenic was present in the same invert sugar. It was later discovered that the sulfuric acid used to produce this sugar had been made from pyrite and contained arsenic. In this way, arsenic had entered the sugar and then made its way into the beer. After the source of the poisoning was discovered, Nicholson stated that the company was unaware that the acid they sold was going to be used in food production, and that they could have provided arsenic-free acid if customers had requested it. There was also no evidence showing that arsenic had been intentionally added to the beer. However, researchers later discovered that arsenic had not only entered the beer through the sugar. During the malt production process, barley grains were dried using hot air produced by burning coke or coal. Some of these fuels contained small amounts of arsenic, and the particles could travel with the smoke and settle on the barley grains, eventually entering the malt and then the beer. This discovery led to old medical cases being reviewed again. Researchers found that many cases in Manchester that had been diagnosed for years as nerve damage caused by alcohol were actually cases of chronic arsenic poisoning. After the results of the investigations were published, some breweries immediately stopped selling their products and removed the contaminated beer from the market. However, others reacted more slowly, and their contaminated products could still be found on the market. As a result, several of these breweries were fined. Thanks for watching until the end. Make sure to like and subscribe for more videos.